Welcome to the Power of Reading, a book review program that discusses the latest Catholic books. A book is a dream you hold in your hand. This program is prepared for Radio Maria Nairobi and presented to you by the Daughters of St. Paul.
Hello, dear listeners, and welcome once again to the Power of Reading program, a book review program. I am your presenter, Sister Beatrice from the Daughters of St. Paul. And in our program, we continue to introduce you to the important classical and latest Catholic books. And this program actually wants to promote and revive the reading culture because reading has good and lasting effects on our faith as Christians and in our everyday life. However, we see that after a few decades of the internet, the written word still stands firm. And in our program today, we shall review the book Rejoice and Be Glad of the Holy Father. And of course, these apostolic exhortations also have a Latin name. And the Latin name for our book, Rejoice and Be Glad, that we shall review today by Pope Francis is Gaudete et Exultate, which means rejoice and be glad. And these are the words you find in the Beatitudes in the 5th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. Welcome back, dear listener, to the Power of Reading program here at Radio Maria Nairobi, a Christian voice in your home. I am your presenter in this program, Sister Beatrice from the Daughters of St. Paul, and today we are reviewing the book Rejoice and Be Glad, the Apostolic Exhortation Gaudete et Exultate of Holy Father Francis, and this is actually on the call to holiness in the world. So the Holy Father wrote this apostolic exhortation to remind us that call of holiness in the world, that call that we are given to transform our world. Because sometimes when we think about holiness, we think just being detached from things of this world, being very dry, cold, pietic people. No, the Holy Father invites us to be the agents of transformation in our world. And he says this is possible. And what he does, he writes his apostolic exhortation, which is divided into 5 chapters. It's not a very large book. It's an intense book, but it is not large. And the 5 chapters, chapter 1 is the call to holiness. And this actually also echoes the Second Vatican Council that invited people in the modern world to holiness, being holy in this modern world. And this call to holiness is a universal call. It's not a call just for a few. Then secondly, he talks about the 2 subtle enemies of holiness. What are the enemies, or what can block us from entering or being holy or making that journey of holiness? Then he talks about in the light of the Master. He talks about going against the flow and the great criterion, and here he uses the Beatitudes that we find in the Gospel of Matthew and also in the Gospel of Luke. And of course, he talks about signs of holiness in today's world. How do we know that we are journeying in the right way? And finally, he talks about spiritual combat, vigilance, and discernment. These are the chapters that you find in this book, Rejoice and Be Glad, Gaudete et Exultate, which is an apostolic exhortation, or is a book written by the Holy Father himself. Now, Pope Francis, in this apostolic exhortation, Rejoice and Be Glad, offers us a very, very powerful magisterial or a church reflection on the universal call to holiness, a topic that is perennial, that is always important. And Jesus tells those persecuted or humiliated for his sake to rejoice and be glad. So we know that the title of this book is taken from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 5, verse 12. Rejoice and be glad. And the Pope, it tells us that the Lord asks everything of us, and he, in return, he offers us true life, the happiness for which you were created. And he wants us to be saints, not to settle for a bland and mediocre existence. That's what he says in the first paragraph. By the way, I forgot to tell you, these documents of the church are usually divided in numbered paragraphs. And it's again for a very simple reason, so that each time we quote them, it's very easy to quote. You just say Gaudete et Exultate number 30. So it's very easy for anyone who would want to confirm or to go and read further what you have quoted, easily to find it. So all the church documents, their paragraphs are numbered because they help us to easily understand. So you'll from time to time hear me mentioning paragraphs, and if you get this book, or even you download it from the internet, because it's also there on the internet, you can be able to download it for free at the Vatican site, then you can be able to know which paragraphs I'm talking about. So when I mention paragraphs, that's also a way that these books are presented to us. And then Rejoice and Be Glad, as I said, is an apostolic exhortation, a type of document that ranks below an encyclical, because an encyclical deals with issues of faith, very, very important, but above every day what we call papal homilies and speeches. The Pope speaks every day, he preaches every day, but from time to time he sits down and puts certain thoughts for us so that we can deeply reflect on them. And this Rejoice and Be Glad actually is the third one that he has issued. As Pope Francis is the third one out of, I think, the 5 that he has issued. The first one that he issued to us was what we call Evangelii Gaudium. That is the joy of the gospel. The other one that he has written is Amoris Laetitia. That is the joy of love. And this is actually about marriage, life, and family. He has written something for the young people. He has written one for the young people, Christ Our Light, that is dedicated to the young people after the synod on the young people. And also we had the synod for the Amazonia region of South America that is called Gerida Amazonia, Beloved Amazon. So those are the apostolic exhortations that we find of Pope Francis. Now, in the introduction, Rejoice and Be Glad, this apostolic exhortation is meant to be practical. Pope Francis is very practical. He's not giving us definitions or a treatise of holiness containing definitions, distinctions, but what he does, he gives us helpful understanding of this important subject. And he actually does more what we'd call a discussion of the various means of sanctification. It is meditation on how to respond to Christ's invitation to become saints. So what the Holy Father does is that he's so practical, he's so pastoral. This is a document that anyone can relate to. And in chapter 1, the call to holiness, Pope Francis discusses the diversity of forms under which holiness appears. And he says we are all called to be witnesses, but there are many actual ways of bearing witness. So we are called to be holy, but not in one way. We are called to be holy in our own diversity. Besides those saints and martyrs whose lives were an exemplary imitation of Christ, Pope Francis also praises what we would call a middle class holiness, a commonplace holiness. And this is the everyday sanctity of those parents who raise their children with immense love, in those men and women who work hard to support their families, in the sick, elderly religious who never lose their smiles. So what Pope Francis is trying to tell us, even when we are toiling in our everyday life, it is also a journey to holiness, because you are sacrificing your strength, your energy. You may say, okay, what I'm doing, I love it, but still it costs you a lot. You have to wake up early. After you have worked, you have to share your earnings with so many people who look up to you to be able to help them. And that is a type of holiness. And he says that the Holy Spirit bestows holiness in abundance among God's holy and faithful people. And of course, this begins with baptism, as he mentions in paragraph 15. And here he invokes the theme of the universal call to holiness. Again, he takes us through a bit the background which informs what he's saying. He doesn't detach himself with the teachings of the church until his time. So he goes back citing Vatican II documents, especially Lumen Gentium, meaning Light to the Nations, number 11. Lumen Gentium is one of the 16 documents that were a fruit of the Second Vatican Council. And number 11 reads, "All faithful, whatever their condition or state, are called by the Lord, each in his or her own way, to that perfect holiness by which the Father himself is perfect." And what the Holy Father does here is to emphasize the phrase, each in his or her own way, for the diversity of forms of holiness means that Christians must discern how the Lord is calling each one of them to holiness. While there are many good forms of life, every person has a unique vocation to whom he or she is called by God. So this also calls to a certain kind of self-awareness. And significantly, Pope Francis notes here that St. John of the Cross, for example, preferred to avoid hard and fast rules for all. He explained that his verses were composed so that everyone could benefit from them in his or her own way. For God's life is communicated to some in one way and to others in another. I think this is a new way of understanding and reflecting. It's not new because it has never existed, but is a way that the Holy Father is inviting us to embrace and to think about. And this will remind many of Pope Francis' constant insistence on the necessity of discernment and prudence concerning individual cases. And this is very, very important for the Holy Father. Each person should be treated individually, because it's very important to understand from where a person is behaving or taking certain decisions or the way they are acting. And in that way, you are able to understand that person and to help them in the best way possible. And of course, the Holy Father, as often as he does, he makes specific mention of women in this section, both holy women like St. Hildegard of Bingen or St. Teresa of Avila, who emerged in times when women tended to be most ignored or overlooked, but also those unknown or forgotten women who nurtured those around them in ways that we know have personally touched Pope Francis. So Pope Francis, in talking about holiness, he also brings that idea of women. He's not being biased, but he's also acknowledging that there is a type of holiness in sometimes the sacrifices that mothers do, women do in life. So while everyone has a unique vocation, every mission has its fullest meaning in Christ and can only be understood through him. And here Pope Francis is, Pope Francis is a Jesuit. He belongs to the Jesuit order. So sometimes what he says and writes comes out also from what we call his Jesuit tradition. For him to be a Christian is to be a disciple of Christ, meaning to enter into the gospel of life. At its core, holiness is experiencing in union with Christ the mysteries of his life, contemplating the mysteries of Christ's life, death, and resurrection, as St. Ignatius of Loyola pointed out, leads us to incarnate them in our choices and attitudes. And this section is in many ways tailored to the hopes expressed also by the young people in what we call the pre-synodal meeting. He had invited young people before the bishops met to share with him their concern. And he writes also that young people understand the general sense of bringing meaning to life and being alive for a purpose, but many do not know how to connect that to vocation as a gift and call from God. And Pope Francis tells them in this exhortation, rejoice and be glad, you too need to see the entirety of your life as a mission. So also that approach to life that whatever I choose to do in life is a mission. Actually, that can help us so much to avoid negative things, because if I see whatever I'm doing, whatever I touch, whoever I encounter as part of my mission, I'm not going to destroy that, because in effect, actually, I'm destroying my own life and destroying my mission. We have said a lot. Let's take a break as we come and briefly look at the other chapters that we find in this book that we are reviewing here today. During this Power to Read program at Radio Maria Nairobi, we are reviewing the book Rejoice and Be Glad, an apostolic exhortation of our Father, Pope Francis. You are listening to the Power of Reading program here at Radio Maria Nairobi. Host and presenter, Sister Beatrice from the Daughters of St. Paul. And today we are looking at this apostolic exhortation, a book, a document written by Pope Francis himself, inviting us to the call to holiness in today's world. And we have already seen the introduction of the book, the meaning of the different papal documents that we get. And now let us see what the Holy Father invites us to be and to do in chapter 2. In chapter 2, the Holy Father talks about two subtle enemies of holiness. And this chapter concerns itself with the two false forms of holiness, because actually they are enemies of holiness, but they appear as if it's holiness itself. And these two, and which can really lead us astray, is what we call Gnosticism and Pelagianism. Gnosticism and Pelagianism. And Pope Francis notably underlines how these tendencies draw oneself and others away from holiness, whereby instead of evangelizing, one analyzes and classifies others, and instead of opening the door of grace, one exhausts his or her energies in inspecting and verifying others, In neither case is one really concerned about Jesus Christ or others. Now, this explanation of the Holy Father is very, very interesting, because Gnosticism and Pelagianism were actually heresies in the early church, in the early centuries of the church. And I would ask you to allow me, dear listener, to read a bit about the two, what the Holy Father says, because they might be new as terminologies, but as practices is something that you can easily relate to what we see in our everyday life. The first one, enemy to holiness, Gnosticism, is something that presumes a purely subjective faith, me and my God, nobody else exists, and whose only interest is a certain experience or a set of ideas and bits of information which are meant to console and enlighten, but which ultimately keep one imprisoned in his or her own thoughts and feelings. So we reduce our faith to being very subjective. What I feel, I seek certain experiences. They may be ecstatic experiences or long periods of silence only by myself. I get a few ideas about God and I stick to them. I have few bits of information that console me, and that is the end of my understanding about God. And what happens to me is that I get imprisoned in my own thoughts and feelings. So this kind of holiness, which is false, is a kind of an intellectual life without God and without flesh. So the Holy Father says, thanks be to God, throughout the history of the church, it has always been clear that a person's perfection is measured not by the information or knowledge they possess, but by the depth of their charity. How am I charitable? How am I compassionate to other people? It's not what I know. I may have a doctorate in theology, but if I don't have charity, I'm not a Christian. And Gnostics, if you have that tendency, or when we have this tendency of Gnosticism being, the Gnostics do not understand this because they judge others based on their ability to understand the complexity of certain doctrines. They think of the intellect as separate from the flesh and thus become incapable of touching Christ's suffering in the flesh of others, and they are locked up as they are in an encyclopedia of thoughts, of abstractions, and in the end, they disembody the mystery, and they prefer a God without Christ, a Christ without a church without her people. Sometimes our prosperity gospel goes in this direction. Money, 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 and success, success, success. Nothing else is important about God. Certainly, this is a superficial conceit. There is much movement on the surface, but the mind is neither deeply moved or affected. Still, Gnosticism exercises a deceptive attraction for some people, since the Gnostic approach is strict and allegedly pure and can appear to possess a certain harmony or order that encompasses everything. So, even as we understand God, the Holy Father is inviting us to have this deep understanding. What is actually happening to me? Am I becoming a bit Gnostic, having a purely subjective faith? And this can block me from that deep experience of God that we call holiness. He also presents another challenge to holiness, another enemy of holiness, and that is Pelagianism. And this Pelagianism is actually a kind of a mindset that the name comes from the one who started this movement in the 3rd century, Pelagius. And those who yield to this Pelagian or semi-Pelagian mindset, even though they speak warmly of God's grace, ultimately trust only their own powers and feel actually superior to others because they observe certain rules or remain insurgently faithful to a particular Catholic style. There are people who compare themselves to others. I have fasted the whole day. Some people cannot fast. That is a kind of Pelagianism. When some of them tell the weak that all things can be accomplished with God's grace, deep down they tend to give the idea that all things are possible by the human will, as if it were something pure, perfect, all-powerful, to which grace is then added. It's like I do everything, then actually the grace of God is for me a kind of a reward. God comes to pat me on the back because I have managed to overcome something, I've managed to do something. And when you are in this situation of Pelagianism, Pope Francis says such kind of people fail to realize that not everyone can do everything, even in the light of faith. If somebody is sick, they cannot be able to attend Mass. You cannot tell them you have to do everything because Mass is important. Or somebody has a sick child. Or somebody may be even too tired, Then I say, no, that should not block you. It's better we bring you in a wheelbarrow. So they fail to realize that not everyone can do everything at all times. And that in life, human weaknesses are not healed completely and once and for all by grace. We grow. In every case, as St. Augustine taught, God commands you to do what you can and to ask for what you cannot, and indeed to pray to Him humbly. Actually, the approach should be that humility, that God may be able to enable us to do what is His will. Grant what you command and command what you will. These are the words of St. Augustine. Ultimately, the lack of a heartfelt and prayerful acknowledgement of our limitations prevents grace from working more effectively within us, for no room is left for bringing about the potential good that is part of a sincere and genuine journey of growth. Grace is grace because it builds on nature and does not make us superhuman all at once, that kind of thinking would show too much that the confidence in our own possibilities. We are not able to be open to what God can give us. So the Pope gives us these two challenges that we can face in our journey to holiness. That is the challenge of Pelagianism or Gnosticism. That is a kind of detachment. One dwells too much on the flesh, the power of the flesh. The other one dwells too much on the intellect. And sometimes you find people who say, no, I have stopped drinking. I don't drink because I have accepted God in my life, but they go to do it hidingly because that is a kind of Pelagianism, because they don't want to be seen in their weakness. And probably seeing them in their weakness, people may be able to pray for them and to help them so that they can live certain habits. So we see this is a very important chapter. Chapter 2, he also brings in the different saints who can help us to be able to integrate ourselves. The whole idea of growing in our faith and also growth in holiness. God does not make us superhuman, but he makes us into his own likeness in spite of our humanity, our weaknesses. The title of chapter 3 is In the Light of the Master, and actually this chapter centers on the example of Jesus, particularly in the interpretation of the Beatitudes and also Matthew 25. The Beatitudes in Matthew 12 and also Matthew 25. And here we can see that there are many theories that the Holy Father says that can constitute the idea of holiness with various explanations and distinctions, but nothing is more enlightening than turning to Jesus' word and seeing his way of teaching the truth. Jesus is our measure in our journey of holiness. And Pope Francis writes that Jesus explained with great simplicity what it means to be holy when he gave us the Beatitudes, as I said in Matthew chapter 5. We can say that the Beatitude is like a Christian's identity card. The Beatitudes are supposed to explain to us what are the attitudes of the kingdom. And they guide us to doing what Pope Francis urges us in chapter 2, namely imitating Jesus. Because for those faithful to God and his word, by their self-giving, gain true happiness. He argues in number 63 of this book we are reviewing, Rejoice and Be Glad, the Apostolic Exhortation. And in this chapter, the Pope notes two ideologies striking at the heart of the Gospels. Those Christians who separate these gospel demands from their personal relationship with the Lord, from their interior union with him, from openness to his grace, and those who suspect the social engagement of others, seeing it as superficial, worldly, and secular and materialistic, communist or populist. Actually, what they are doing is like helping us to see or to think of the church as an NGO. No, the church is not an NGO. He says, actually, the church is supposed to bring out that which is good in every one of us. So he argues that one should also affirm the good of one's neighbor as integral to the Christian life. And Francis elaborates on this second point at some length, actually invoking St. Thomas Aquinas again to argue that works of mercy towards neighbor give greater glory to God more than even acts of worship. Some of us are very good in running to church, but very poor in relating with other people. And we can say also one of the moments that also Pope Francis talks about is living life for others. He talks about the dignity of human life. And the dignity of human life is from conception to death, to the moment of death, in all aspects, in aspects of being allowed to live, being allowed to access dignified livelihood. If a person is living in poverty, then there is something not right with our society, even our own journey of holiness, because I cannot be in abundance and another person is in want and still say, I'm still making my journey to holiness. So this is what he talks about in chapter 2, where he invites us to follow Christ himself in his words, especially with the example of Matthew chapter 5, where we find the Beatitudes, and chapter 25, where we see the last judgment. We are going to take a very brief break so that we briefly look at chapter 4 and 5, and also we conclude our program for today. You are listening to the Power of Reading program here at Radio Maria Nairobi, a Christian voice in your home. I am your presenter, Sister Beatrice from the Daughters of St. Paul, and today we are reviewing the book by Pope Francis, the Apostolic Exhortation, Rejoice and Be Glad, which is a call to holiness in today's world. Now, we see chapter 4 deals with what we call the signs of holiness in today's world. And here the Pope presents to us 5 great expressions of love for God and neighbor that it takes to be of particular importance in the light of certain dangers and limitations present in today's culture. And those signs or spiritual attitudes will help us understand the way of life to which the Lord calls us. And Pope Francis first states that these 5 attitudes, of course, he talks about the negative tendencies that can be there within the world and also explains them to us. And he talks about these 5 signs of holiness. The first sign is perseverance, patience, and meekness. That's the first sign, perseverance, patience, and meekness. The second sign is joy and a sense of humor. The third sign is boldness and passion. The fourth sign is being in community, and the 5th sign is constant in prayer. And there's a lot we can say about this. This is one of the best written chapters of this document that really situate us. How can I live holiness in our world today? We would expect the Holy Father to say many rosaries and other things. He talks about the normal things that we are supposed to do in our lives, to persevere, to be patient, to be humble, to have joy and a sense of humor, to be bold, to have passion. We need courage in this world. It's not easy. To live within community, to be part of the community, not to isolate ourselves, and of course, constant prayer. I would just want to say something about the joy and a sense of humor. Again, I'll quote my favorite Saint Thomas More, who actually suffered a lot, but he lived this gift as a saint. The Holy Father says he recommends that we should pray the prayer attributed to St. Thomas More. The prayer attributed to St. Thomas More says, "Grant me, O Lord, good digestions and also something to digest. Grant me a healthy body and the necessary good humor to maintain it. Grant me a simple soul that knows to treasure all that is good and that doesn't frighten easily at the sight of evil." And he also talks, but rather finds the means to put things back in their place. Give me a soul that knows not boredom, grumbling, sighs and laments, nor excess or stress because of that obscuring thing I call I. Grant me, O Lord, a sense of good humor. Allow me the grace to be able to take a joke and to discover in life a bit of joy and to be able to share it with others. I can imagine that even holiness invites us to this being humorous, trying to make people laugh, not to use jokes to hurt people, but to be at peace. Sometimes when things happen, to be able to laugh at it. Chapter 5 talks about spiritual combat, vigilance, and discernment. And this is very, very important. It's very important to talk about spiritual combat, which might sound old-fashioned, but Pope Francis talks about it that Christian life is a constant battle. It's a constant battle. It's not a battle we do with fear, with trembling, but a battle we do with God himself. Whatever is happening to us, we know that God is at our side. So we have to battle with the world mentality. We have to battle against our human weaknesses. We have also to battle against evil. And the spiritual life demands vigilance, keeping our lamps lit, and to avoid pitfalls. You know, I cannot expose myself to everything and expect to be able to move on. It also talks about discernment. Discernment is very important for Pope Francis. It's very important for the Jesuits. It's one of the gifts they have given to the church, to be able to weigh things, to reflect deeply, to pray over our choices, what we are choosing, even good choices, to make sure that each time we take a little step back and reflect, this step I'm taking, in which direction is it going to take me? And also, actually, Pope Francis also talks about discernment more than intelligence. That's why it's important to pray for the gift of the Holy Spirit in whatever step we are taking. Of course, in discernment, there's decision making, but we should not rush to the decision. seeing the pros and the cons, but also to ask God for guidance, to take a little time to pray over things, to think of what you're feeling deeply inside. Is this a good step that I am taking? And of course, the Holy Father, as in most or all the documents that we always encounter in the church, concludes with Mary. Mary as a person who is an example to us on how to live our holiness. Mary as our model for holiness, because Mary is the saint among saints and blessed above all others. And if we follow her example, Pope Francis urges we shall share the happiness that the world will not be able to take from us. So that is our brief review of this Rejoice and Be Glad, the Apostolic Exhortation Gaudete et Exultate of Holy Father Francis. Dear listener, again, I want to encourage you to get a copy of this book. You can get it in any of our Catholic bookshops. You can also be able to buy it through our website page, paulinesafrica.org. You can be able to shop on our online shop, Paulines Online. You can be able to get it there. It can be delivered to you anywhere in this world. Or you can even download a PDF copy from the Vatican website. It is there for free. You can be able to read it, and it's a very beautiful book. I would encourage even to read as a group, not only to read alone. You can read it with your friends, discuss it or meditate on it, or even in the family. It is a book that you can really read, and it can help you to journey in your journey of faith. And thank you for being with us in this program, The Power to Read. We continue to grow our reading community, and I encourage you to continue reading the Word of God and reading all the other books that we present to you from time to time and that you come across that can help you to grow in your faith and also to grow in your human development. I want to thank Mr. Timothy Moreithi, our studio technician who has recorded this program here at Paulines Studios, Nairobi. I have been your presenter, Sister Beatrice. I encourage you to continue to listen to our programs. You can also be able to listen to our podcast that will be posted soon at Radio Maria Nairobi website page. You can be able to listen to this program and also to listen to other books that we have already reviewed and we have posted there as a podcast. So thank you. I've been your presenter, Sister Beatrice from the Daughters of St. Paul, and may God bless you, and let us meet next week, God willing. Thank you and bye-bye.
You have been listening to the Power of Reading program. Join us next week as we continue discovering the wonderful world of books. This program is prepared for Radio Maria Nairobi and presented to you by the Daughters of St. Paul.